Welcome to the global seminar of the Global Columbia Collaboratory. I am Shannon Marquez, Dean for Undergraduate Global Engagement at Columbia University, and I'm so excited that you've joined us today for a conversation about the future of democracy. Now, since democracy is under grave threat worldwide, it is indeed an honor to have a panel of distinguished experts here with us, stepping into the Global Columbia Collaboratory to have a robust discussion about the fragility of democracy today and its consequences. With the disruption caused by the pandemic, Columbia University Center for Undergraduate Global Engagement, in partnership with Columbia Global Centers and Columbia World Projects, launched the Global Columbia Collaboratory. It is a virtual exchange initiative to support students around the world. The collaboratory brings students, thought leaders, and educators together, promotes cross-cultural communication, and enhances skills and global competence to allow students to reflect, ideate, and collaborate to empower them to make a difference in the world. Students participate from 23 different countries and are drawn from all 3 undergraduate schools, representing over 30 majors. And we also have students participate from dual degree programs with Sciences Po in Paris, Trinity College Dublin as well. And using smartphones and laptops to access the Collaboratory's virtual exchange platform, students form a community of global thinkers and problem solvers through participations in themed global seminars featuring international speakers, such as our seminar today, as well as they participate in facilitated reflection, ideation, and collaboration activities. Excuse me. As learnings and perspectives are shared across the collaboratory, students are encouraged to collaborate to support the further development of ideas into projects that have the potential to address the most urgent challenges of our time. Students then form project teams and receive funding to tackle specific global issues and topics of interest, and their work is featured in an online gallery. So we are thrilled that over 260 student participants have been actively engaged in the collaboratory since it launched this past summer, including undergraduate students, observers, and graduate student assistants. And we currently have a spring semester cohort of collaboratory students joining us live today from around the world, including a group of Columbia Engineering Entrepreneurship Design Challenge students who are developing interdisciplinary technology-driven solutions as a part of their experience in the collaboratory. Welcome to all of you. Now, some of our students will ask questions to our panelists today, and I encourage the global audience to also submit questions through the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. Again, I want to welcome everyone to the Global Columbia Collaboratory Seminar, and I want to thank all of our partners and esteemed panelists. We are so pleased to be working directly with the Columbia Global Centers for these seminars. And at this time, I want to introduce Safwan Majri, Columbia University Executive Vice President for Global Centers and Global Development, who will introduce us to our panelists today. Safwan?
Thank you very much, Shannon. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever in the world you might be, and welcome to our distinguished panel of experts. You know, as the 20th century moved towards the 21st, after the Soviet Union had collapsed and the third wave of democratization had washed over the world, it seemed logical to believe that the authoritarianism that remained in other parts of the world would eventually and inevitably implode. In its place, democracy would take root. Not democracy defined simply as access to a ballot box, but the entire ecosystem of the ballot, with access to information, choice, systemic check and balances, and a robust civil society. Yet, what looked to be an irrepressible and universal demand for democracy was anything but. We currently inhabit a world where democracy is in crisis. Authoritarianism continues to loom large in some corners of the world. Hopes that a fourth wave of democratization would sweep across the Arab world were dashed when political openings quickly closed, giving way instead to a return to an oppressive military rule in Egypt and a spiraling into civil war and humanitarian crises in Syria, Yemen, and Libya, the likes of which we had not seen since the Second World War. With the exception of Tunisia, the Arab Spring uprisings failed, and even Tunisia's success is a qualified one. The nation's economy is in shambles and its democratic experiment is fragile. Elsewhere, democratically elected strongmen have fundamentally eroded the institution of democracy, from Turkey to Brazil to India to Hungary to the Philippines. And then there is the United States, a country that has long positioned itself as the standard bearer of democracy. For decades, it has sent well-funded teams of experts to other countries to help draft constitutions and set up democratic electoral systems. So it was with shock when the world witnessed America facing the threat of the overturn of a fair and free election, led by the losing incumbent and with support from a significant swath of the public. All done in the name of democracy, or a democracy as the insurrections defined it, limited in scope to a certain demographic. Do we still believe that the march and triumph of democracy is inevitable? Again and again, populist outsiders assume power in the name of the people, yet they sow misinformation and distrust, eroding the institutional bedrock of democratic governance and making it easier to employ populist divisions. This is especially true in multi-ethnic democracies, where divisions abet nativist ideologues and pose serious threats to civil liberties. How did our expectation become so at odds with reality? It seems the viability of democracy is indexed to global economic forces that were not nearly as obvious a generation or two ago. Um, sorry. The slowed economic growth of the past few decades has produced an atmosphere of resentment and dissatisfaction, and the plague of economic inequality jeopardizes the whole system, paving the way for the populist outsider and anti-democratic shifts. And we are learning again that politics is local, that there are no grand unified movements sweeping the globe like a spring breeze. There are discrete local developments, responsive to specific diverse histories and needs. Despite half the world living in a democracy of some kind, the number of people enjoying a full democracy has dropped precipitously in the past few years to less than 5%. The pandemic has only exacerbated this decline, as some governments have restricted freedoms and suspended civil liberties. In defining the intellectual framework and practices upon which democracy rests, we generally look to foundational documents and inherited practices. Reforms tend to be directed from older institutions towards newer ones, and we rely on history as both a guide and bulwark. But it's possible that instead of illuminating a path forward, these centuries-old documents and traditions obscure the problems and prevent us from progress. Constructed in a completely different world, one that limited civic participation to specific classes and genders, one without electricity, let alone jet travel and internet connectivity, the institutions we customarily turn to may not be able to contend with the world as it is today. What are the consequences of this fragility? Although it is counterintuitive, newer democracies, such as what emerged in Tunisia in 2011, may be of more help than older ones as we consider the current threats to global democracy. The hunger for authentic participation and for basic fairness have inspired innovations that are already transforming the political landscape, such as ranked choice voting and holding referenda. As these practices migrate from continuing liberation movements, they become tools towards the repair of democracy, rooted in a relentless demand for justice and a reformation of the institutions meant to encourage democracy to flourish. The questions I have just outlined, and so much more, will be addressed in today's discussion by our august panelists and by our moderator, Frederick Harris, Dean of Social Sciences and Professor of Political Science at Columbia University. Dean Harris's research interests are primarily in American politics with a focus on race and politics, political participation, social movements, and political development. His publications include his multi-award-winning Something Within, Religion in African American Political Activism, and The Price of the Ticket, Barack Obama and the Rise and Decline of Black Politics, and with Robert Lieberman, Beyond Discrimination, Racial Inequality in a Post-Racist Era. His essays have appeared in Dissent, the London Review of Books, the New York Times, and the Washington Post, among others. Dean Harris also served as Vice President of the American Political Science Association and was a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution, a visiting scholar at the Russell Sage Foundation, a fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in Washington, D.C., and a visiting professor at the Pantheon Sorbonne University in Paris. He will, in short, be able to bring in considerable depth and perspective to our discussion and to moderate the discussion ahead. Fred, I'll turn it over to you to introduce our panelists, pose questions to each, and then we can pivot to a more integrated discussion. Later, we will have a Q&A with our students and global public. Thank you, and over to you, Fred.
Thank you, Safwan, for that those enlightening introductory comments. I have to say, as a political scientist who studies race and politics in the United States, that the topic before us, the erosion of democracy across the globe, is not as current in our politics as one might think, at least not for the US. I was not surprised by the siege on the US Capitol in January, nor by the erosion of democratic norms and the weakening of democratic institutions that have transpired in the US for the past few years. For those of us who have a long view of the history of racial conflict in the US, the suppression and attempts at suppression of democratic rights and practices for segments of the US population has always stood alongside what many saw or continue to see as the successful execution of democratic norms and institutions in the US. For people of color and for African Americans in particular, the opportunity to enjoy democratic rights has not been the story of the shiny city on the hill, as American exceptionalists have proclaimed of the US for many generations. It's not been a story of steady progress of a people move easily and successfully from slavery to freedom. During the Reconstruction era of the mid to late 19th century, white supremacists and terrorists overthrew democratically elected local and state governments in the US South. And during the first half of the 20th century, autocratic regimes and populist ferment dominated state governments in the region while existing alongside a national government that was considered the beacon of democracy throughout the world. During the period of legal segregation known as Jim Crow, pro-segregationists used disinformation campaigns through groups and institutions such as the White Citizens Councils and the intelligence gathering operations such as the Mississippi Sovereignty Commission to suppress the rights of African Americans via laws as well as outright violence. So in my view, the current weakening of democracy in the United States is not an aberration, but a resurgence of an illiberal politics that was once confined to the southern region of the United States. Though the suppression of democratic practices was largely present in the South, today these sentiments and actions have become part and parcel of national politics in the US. Indeed, 57% of the white voting public, nearly 6 of 10 whites in the US, voted for a sitting president who stroked the flames of white supremacy and anti-Muslim and anti-Asian sentiments and prejudice against immigrants of color more generally. That occurred in the year 2020, not in the year 1920. As we think about what's happening globally today, let us not forget that the nation that is thought by many to be the beacon of democracy has had a contradictory past, a past whose history is still unfolding before us. So we have 4 esteemed panelists who will provide us with perspectives on why there's a decline of democracy across the globe today. I'd like to introduce first my colleague in the Political Science Department, Vicky Murillo, who is Professor of Political Science and International and Public Affairs at Columbia. She also directs the University Center on Latin American Studies. Professor Murillo is the author or co-author of several books, most recently of The Politics of Institutional Weakness in Latin America. Her research focuses on linkages between political parties and richer and poorer voters, the economic determinants of electoral volatility in Latin America, legislators and economic representation in Argentina, and the dynamics of weak institutions more generally in the region. Another one of my colleagues in the political science department, who I hope will get us started with talking about the sort of the foundations of many of these topics, is the political theorist, Nadia Urbinati, who specializes in modern and contemporary political thought and the democratic and anti-democratic traditions. She is the author of several books on democratic thought, including Me, the People, How Populism Transforms Democracy, as well as the book The Tyranny of the Moderns and Democracy Disfigured, Opinion, Truth, and the People. Professor Urbinati's writings have appeared in international scholarly journals, and she writes as a political columnist for Italian newspapers. Among her many awards is one from the President of the Italian Republic, recognized, quote, for her contributions to the study of democracy and the diffusion of Italian liberal and democratic thought abroad. Another panelist we have here, distinguished panelist we have here, is Tessa Murphy-Brennan, who is visiting Columbia this academic year as part of the third cohort of the Obama Foundation Scholars, an initiative that is designed to inspire, empower, and connect emerging leaders with the tools they need to make their efforts more effective. Dr. Murphy is a cultural anthropologist by training, but is known more for her grassroots activism in Budapest, Hungary. She leads the Office for Community Participation, which is charged with helping to increase civic engagement for some of Budapest's most disenfranchised citizens, with an aim to ensure that they cultivate deeper connections and ownership of their local government. She is also the co-founder of the School of Public Life, a grassroots education research center that looks to rebuild Hungarian democracy. Yasha Mounk is an author and public speaker known for his work on the rise of populism and the crisis of liberal democracy. He is an associate professor of practice of international affairs at Johns Hopkins University and a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. He has authored 3 books. His book, The People versus Democracy, Why Our Freedom is in Danger and How to Save It, garnered widespread press attention in the media. The book attempts to explain the causes of the global rise in populism and examines how to renew liberal democracy. He is also a contributing editor at The Atlantic and has written for the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Affairs, and serves as a regular columnist and contributor for several major international publications. And so as you see, we have a very distinguished panel here. And so I want to start us off. Safwan identified various forces in his introduction that have undermined democracy throughout the world. These include the rise of populism, disinformation, the spread of disinformation, rise in economic inequality, as well as the sharp rise of populations across the globe that express deep distrust of democratic institutions and practices. So I want to start our conversations off with a few simple questions. Why do you all think democracy is in crisis, if indeed you think it's in crisis across the board? And what do you believe has necessitated this crisis? And so I want to go first to a person who can give us some foundations to the meaning of democracy, and that's Nadia. Nadia, can you get us started?
Sure. Thank you for this introduction and very challenging question, I would say. Now, you know, the question of crisis is a very tricky one because democracy is permanently in a crisis. A crisis is an ancient word that means making a judgment or a decision that is making a kind of interruption between a moment A and a moment B, which is what we do when we make a choice or we make a judgment. So crisis is the expression of a permanent process of decision-making, a change in positions, a change in decisions. So in some sense, democracy and crisis, they go together. However, representative democracy, meaning democracy that are based on regular elections, multi-party or more than two parties competing, that are based on a large, broad civil organizations of society with movements, unions, associations of any kinds of, thus a rich system of connections, thanks to which the individual citizens can make their own voice heard, and they are capable of overcoming the weakness that they may have as individual citizens. So the question of modern democracy is precisely to combine the individually based right to vote, which gives us power, but a very sense of limited power, because it's a small event, the voting moment. So to overcome this weakness, thanks to associations of any kinds, political and social. So representative democracy thus are complex, are rich, and they have an ambition. The ambition of never allowing economic differences, which sometimes are strong inequalities, never allow them to translate into political institutions or lawmaking power. Because at that point, the inequality that we can even tolerate at the social level, they become a reason for unequal distribution of power in influencing the system and making decisions, and this becomes less tolerable. This is precisely what happens, in my view, today. And thus, voting for Trump or voting for Salvini or voting for other populists is a reflection of the broad dissatisfaction and the sense of frustration for a political system that promises us to treat us equally and in effect gives us instead a very unequal reflection of our social station or social power. Thus, representative democracies are losing their legitimacy, not a formal or constitutional kind of losing legitimacy, but they're losing their legitimacy all around the world in the perception citizens have of their own power, as democracies promise them to have power, equal power to influence and to make decisions. So it is a kind of crisis of a kind of perception of power, of empowerment that people have, but for reasons that are external to the institutions and external to the process of decision making. They are social and economic or educational issues. So the declines thus of democracy's perceived legitimacy, on which populism gains credibility, tells us that the problems faced by representations in today's democracy comes from ways representatives and the public have begun to function in relation to the unequal distribution of power in society. So I think that many political theorists or social, perhaps more political theorists than political scientists, they talk about democracy, they talk about an ideal promise of equal distribution of power, and yet today, this talk becomes more and more difficult to be made without many specifications. And thus, it is precisely this tension between the social empirical fact and the political procedural institutions that is into a crisis, in my view at least. So it is an infringement of equality that jeopardizes democratic procedures, regulating the access to representation by lowering the barriers against arbitrariness. This is what we have today. We have the ability of many very wealthy and rich people, a small portion of society, they have more power to influence lawmakers, to influence the way in which the justice operates. And this means that we don't feel like to be working in the same boat, because we are in the same boat, but each of us, or many of us, they have not the same power. In a recent book, a very interesting, by a Nobel laureate and a colleague of him, Angus Dayton and Anne Case, a book that tells a very sad story in the States, but this is almost can be repeated in other countries, in my view, that is Death of Despair and the Future of Capitalism. In this book, it's clear that what we are witnessing is not simply a question of inequality. It is a question of inequality, how it translates into expectation of a better life in society and an expectation of the ability of impacting the political system. This is a real crisis, in my view. It is thus not procedural or institutions. It is a crisis of the translation of one power into another one, economic power into political power. And if this happens with too much of easiness, as we see today, many people can, as this happens all the time, they can think that perhaps all the promises that these great promises that democracy makes us are promises that democracy itself is not capable of fulfilling or respect, because there is no longer the same equal possibility that all classes, middle class, working class, minorities or of racial or gender or any kind of, they don't have actually the same equal capability of making themselves heard at the institutional level. Or if they make themselves heard, it is by radical events like uprising or like voting for strong leaders in the illusion that this will give them more power. So I would stop here now just to show that this, what we call crisis of democracy, makes us necessarily an invitation to go outside of the institutions and outside of the procedures into society and the economic.
Nadia, thank you so much. You've given a lot for us to chew on there, particularly sort of interrogating the whole concept of the crisis of democracy and connecting it to a crisis of the perception of legitimacy. And I think this is a great opportunity here for a comparativist to jump in. Vicky, could you give us a perspective on this?
Thanks a lot for the invitation to this fantastic panel. It's a privilege to be here, and especially coming after Nadia. And I have to say, I totally agree with her, what she said. And I want to reflect. Yesterday was the anniversary of the 1976 military coup in Argentina. I was a little kid, and I really learned the value of democracy because of the violence that came with dictatorship. That's, you know, I learned it as a little kid. I was unable to vote in the first democratic election because I was too young. But the candidate who won promised not just peace and justice, which he delivered actually, but also, here I quote, "With democracy, you can eat, you can cure, and you can educate," which he could not deliver. But because of the fear of violence of we had gone through, we were patient enough to, you know, sustain democracy despite a very deep economic crisis. So is democracy the regime that provides the best performance? I don't think that's the promise of democracy. The promise of democracy in terms of outcomes is just to minimize risk for citizens, I guess, in a sense, say, because it gives to citizens the possibility of make themselves heard, of kicking out those who made the wrong decisions. And if that's the case, I see three challenges to democracy. I don't know if democracy is in crisis or not, but I do see three challenges that are related to what Nadia and both Safwan and Frederick had actually said. The first one is about performance, the societal aspect that Nadia emphasized, right? With the eat, the cure, the educate. I think that democracy is in the context of increasing inequality and not just inequality, increased rapid technological change, increased movement of people around the world, and now with the pandemic and economic and health crisis, has dramatically increased the insecurity of citizens. And that makes it for people harder to just be patient or pay attention to the merely procedural aspects of democracy. I think those are very important, but people care about how democracy works in terms of how they get in terms of eating, curing, educated, how they see their life coming in the future. And again, if I look at Latin America, the decline in support of democracy, although it's from like 70% to about 60%, started before the pandemic because the decline in inequality that had happened in the early 2000s and the decline in poverty that had happened in the early 2000s stopped with the end of the commodities boom. So certainly there is a relationship between performance and regime that we need to be paying attention to. The second challenge is the procedural challenge. And here I think the point that Nadia made about perceptions of elites is crucial. And here I would say not just economic elites, but also technocratic elites. And again, I think in Latin America, this is very obvious. The perception of the population, we have very high levels of inequality historically, is that the economic elites are very separate from society. They think very differently. When corruption scandals start, the idea is that they have bought off political elites, that collusion makes the political system less legitimate. And so we should pay attention to procedures in making the system appears legitimate, I mean, not be legitimate to the majorities of the population. And here voting is crucial. And I think voting is not sufficient, but certainly it makes the basic element of responsiveness of politicians and their challenges to free and fair election across many countries in the world and within countries in the world. I mean, the idea of subnational authoritarianism that Fred pointed to the US is not just unique to the US, and there's a lot of comparative work that includes the US. But also this idea that not just that leaders are taking advantage of crisis to restrict check and balances and freedoms, but also that the increase in insecurity is built on the decline of a structure, institutional structure, like the welfare state in Europe or in the United States, that is in crisis because it was built on sexist, racist, and exclusionary terms. I mean, the outsiders in the informal sector in Latin America were never included in the welfare state. Domestic workers and agricultural workers were never included in the United States. The bread mail winner assume a women at home. So I mean, and we can so those groups that had a kind of solve the tension between inequality of less inequality in the economic realm and were included by the political system feel more insecure now. So a lot of what we're seeing is also a backlash that's produced by the insecurity of groups that were in a relatively privileged position before. And that, I think, is behind the populist reaction, not just against economic elites, but against technocratic elites. I really want to emphasize, because we do belong more to this later group, the experts. And I agree with Safwan. I think there's a lot of discussion of procedural innovation coming from new democracies, referendums, ranked choice, ideas about lottery sorting with random samples for different quotas of citizens that are coming. But I think the effort of all of this procedural innovation is how to, I don't think it's really to make decisions better, although I know people disagree here. I think it's to provide a sense of inclusion in the political process, to make citizens accept the outcome, even if they don't like it, because it's fair. And they will have a chance next time to have their voice as part of the process. And finally, I want to point to the third challenge that I think Safwan mentioned, which is the geopolitical dimension. I agree. I remember the end of the Berlin Wall and Fukuyama declaring the end of history. And the US is starting to export democracy. Of course, it was not very persuasive in Latin America, given a history of US intervention and support for military coups. And in fact, that history permeates the racism that Fred pointed out. I mean, there is a reason why Puerto Rico was not considered a place that could have citizenship. It was totally related to racial understanding of democracy. So I think it's a long-term discussion that should be comparative and not just within the United States. But here, I think we are at a point where we have competing regimes, democracies and non-democracies, with difference in performance. That difference in performance is going to affect how people perceive the legitimacy of the regimes. And the challenge that I see now with COVID and the pandemic, and this is pretty clear, the vaccine supply it's very unequal around the world. We were talking about vaccination. And China and Russia are stepping in to provide vaccines to poor countries. And that affects how these countries are being perceived. I mean, yesterday, the Colombian ambassador to the United States, and this is a country that's a close ally to the United States, that has a center-right government, was talking about human rights in China being very good and thanking China for the vaccine efforts and how it's, helping not only their own citizens, but also citizens of poor countries. So I think, again, the way the US and Europe are performing on the pandemic, it's going to affect how the rest of the world perceive the regimes that are in these countries. So I'm closing here. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Vicky. You said a great deal there. Absolutely agree in your analysis, particularly as it relates to deepening inequality and what impact it's having on perceptions of performance, on perceptions of whether democratic institutions are working. Yasha, what do you have to say to this question about the crisis of democracy?
Yeah, so we seem to be entering a little bit of a debate into whether there is a crisis of democracy. So perhaps it's worth actually laying out some of the empirical evidence for a moment, and then I want to make a bridge to what they might or might not tell us about the future of democracy. Okay. So Freedom House just published its annual report about the state of democracy in 2020. And what it showed is that we're in the 15th year of what they call a democratic recession. So that means that for each of the last 15 years, more countries have moved towards authoritarianism, away from democracy, away from political and civil rights, than towards it. And in fact, 2020 was the steepest year of a democratic recession. The difference between the number of countries that were moving away from democracy and the number of countries that were moving towards it was larger in 2020 than it was in any of the previous 14 years. India, the world's most populous democracy, is no longer classified as free by Freedom House. It is now classified as partly free. As you may know, just on a parochial note, Pratap Banumeta, who I believe has ties to Colombia, has been forced to resign from Ashoka University because of his criticisms of Narendra Modi. I believe Madhav Khoshla, who is also affiliated with the law school here, may end up having to take a similar kind of step. So we are really seeing an incredible attack on free institutions in key democracies. Because of India being classified as partly free, there is now fewer than 1 in 5 people in the world who live in a country that is considered as free. And of course, those countries include democracies that for a very long time were considered to be clearly consolidated by political scientists. Tessa, I'm sure, will have more to say about the situation in Hungary, but Hungary is a country in which people assumed that democracy was safe. It was supposed to be a consolidated democracy, and yet Hungary too is now classified as only partly free by Freedom House. Now, that means that what we're dealing with here is not just a quantitative retrenchment. It is not just that there are waves of democracy, as Samuel Huntington pointed out a long time ago, that there was a big wave of democratization in the late 80s and early 90s, and that now we're seeing the reverse wave, that it turns out that in some of the countries where we hoped that democracy would take root, they perhaps were not affluent enough, perhaps did not have enough democratic tradition for those systems to hold, and now we're starting to see them decline again. What we're seeing is something that goes beyond that, and that is that democracy is in a new way under threat in countries where we could long take democratic stability for granted. But we have to worry about democratic stability not just in countries like India or Tanzania, which has recently had real democratic setbacks, where that shouldn't surprise political scientists that much, given a whole bunch of other indicators that normally correlate with instability, but that we're seeing the same thing also in North America and Western Europe, and in other supposedly consolidated democracies around the world. The rise of illiberal politicians, of populist candidates who claim that they and they alone speak for the people, and that anybody who disagrees with them is by virtue of that fact illegitimate. So that is why I believe that there is a real crisis of democracy, that it is worth taking that seriously, and that for all of the past imperfections of democracy, what is going on at the moment is qualitatively different and something we should substantially worry about. So how does that change the outlook of democracy for the future? Well, look, if you had a view of a world where you think that once democracies have managed to establish themselves, and once democracies reach a certain economic threshold, they are essentially stable, then your view is by definition quite optimistic, because you think, hey, here's a set of countries that are already democratic. Over time, we're going to add more to them as countries democratize, as countries become more affluent. And so the realm of democracy is going to keep increasing. Now, if you're really optimistic, perhaps you think that countries like China are sure to democratize as well. If you're not quite that optimistic, you say, well, perhaps it'll only be one part of the world, and there's other countries that will never quite democratize. But your essential baseline is pretty optimistic. Well, if you suddenly realize that democratic consolidation is not a one-way street, but countries can deconsolidate as well as consolidate, that we can go backward as well as forward, the view changes. There is a much broader variability, a bigger variance of the kinds of outcomes you might suspect. And so it's worth interrogating for a minute, the theory that is always a kind of reference point that Vicky mentioned, The End of History by Francis Fukuyama, right? The core claim of that article, which is much more subtle than people who haven't read it tend to believe, is that liberal democracies, political systems that manage to guarantee both individual freedom and collective self-determination, are better than competitor regimes, are better in particular than fascism and communism, the two most important competitor regimes of the 20th century, at sustaining the legitimacy of their citizens, at sustaining adherence from their citizens. So I think it's worth going back to that question. Has a credible competitor regime to liberal democracy emerged? Is that what's going on? Well, I don't think China is. China works in relatively well in practice, but it doesn't really work in theory, and that matters. It is impossible to emulate or to copy China for a country that doesn't share its very particular history. There are some competitor regimes with regional appeal, theocracy in parts of the Middle East, on the model of Iran is one of them, but they do not have strong appeal beyond the regions and only have limited appeal even within those regions. Populism seems to be a kind of alternative, but populism actually is not really coherent either, because populist politicians claim that they are more democratic than the people who are currently in power. They claim that they will return power to the people, but in reality, what they do is to move countries in an authoritarian direction and install themselves as quasi-dictators. So populism is a very powerful tool against liberal democracy. It's a very powerful way of subverting it, but it does not create long-term political regimes that actually provide real competition on the plane of ideas to it. And we're seeing in many countries around the world that eventually in Turkey and Hungary and Venezuela and many other countries around the world, once populists really show their true face and become dictators, populations become very, very disenchanted with them. They may not be able to remove them because at that point they have control of all the levers of power, but they're not able to sustain their legitimacy. So I think that Fukuyama still remains right on all of that. The thing that he may have been wrong about is that democracies have turned out to have less legitimacy than he anticipated, but democracies actually have greater trouble sustaining the consent and the legitimacy of their own citizens than he assumed. And so, the two questions about the future of democracy are, number one, will democracies do better than they have done over the last 20 or 30 years in earning the deep support of their citizens and becoming an appealing beacon which makes countries aspire to democracy, or at least pretend that they are democracies again? And the second question is whether some kind of credible alternative to liberal democracy emerges, whether the systems that currently are real-world competitors to democracy are able to strike onto an exportable model that can be emulated by other countries and that earns some legitimacy within their own citizens, that provide a real competitor to democracy. I think those are both open questions. At the moment, semi-optimistically, I would say that the likelihood of democracy fixing some of its problems is higher than the likelihood of a credible alternative to liberal democracy coalescing. But the good thing about the future is that it's very hard to predict. So, for better or worse, we're likely to find out over the next decades.
Yeah, thanks so much, Yasha, for providing a broad overview of different political structures and regimes, and providing some complexity to this question about the crisis of democracy globally. Tessa, you can give us a bird's eye perspective, because you're actually been on the ground as a grassroots activist, trying to strengthen democracy in a society, in a country where democratic institutions were strengthened or expanded after the crumbling of the Berlin Wall. Could you give us your perspective on this question about the crisis of democracy, hopefully from your bird's eye view?
Yeah, thanks a lot for the invitation. And I will try to give you an overview of what I think has been happening in Hungary over the past 30 years very quickly. And of course, I'm not a political scientist, so all this comes from kind of grassroots knowledge that is produced by activists and their academic friends in Hungary. And
which is important, by the way, I just want to say, which is equally important.
And yeah, of course, I mean, 1989, 1990, that was the turning point in Hungary's history when the change of regimes happened, and we went from state socialism to kind of democratic capitalism. And it was a celebrated time when all the democratic institutions were born. And I think at that time, Hungary was really admired in the region, because we had a lot of these democratic institutions that were not necessarily present in other parts of Eastern Europe, like, very strong municipalities, the right to free association and ethnic self-governments. Like, it seemed to be a really good example of a country on the course of democratization. And I think in the 1990s, there was this big outburst of NGOs and civic associations and volunteers, and the state and civil organizations were working in a kind of partnership collaboration. And I think there was not a lot of critique by NGOs, grassroots organizations of the state, and especially the money that came in from the EU before EU accession, but also, around the time Hungary joined the European Union, may not have been a very positive impact in the long run on Hungarian civil society, because we were flooded with money, and a lot of civil organizations and grassroots activity was, kind of obsessed or spend their time spending the money of the EU on nice projects and creating financial reports, but not necessarily building democracy from the ground up. And then the 2000s were a little bit, I think, more active in terms of social movements, especially as a reaction to the global justice movement. But then came 2010. And that's when the Fidesz government, or Viktor Orbán's government, took over. And I just want to kind of see why this could have happened. And that's when in 2010, that's when the decline of democracy started in Hungary, or that's the kind of general narrative. But I don't think that's when it started. I don't think it ever thrived, to be honest, even before that. Because even before 2010, even though we had these democratic institutions in place, I don't think people really felt an ownership of these democratic institutions. There was not real political education taking place. And I'm not talking about schools. I had to take, civic education classes, but that didn't mean that I owned the institutions of democracy that were created for me. Also, there was a lot of kind of middle class activism before 2010, but people who were experiencing oppression or social disadvantages were not really involved in any kind of social movement building. So it was very much a middle class, privileged kind of activism, but the people who were really the losers of the regime change, which were millions of people, were not really mobilizing and not really feeling that this was their system and that they the government belonged to them. Also, I think Hungarians tend to have this self-view of we are always passive. We are never able to change anything. Our revolutions always lose. So why it's not even worth trying to organize protests. And I think this is a really kind of negative, this is a really harmful self-view that is being promoted in our educational system, which is totally not true, but still a lot of people believe in it. And I think grassroots organizations didn't do a very good job of countering this self-narrative of, we are never able to change things. The state will always prevail, and the state is always stronger than us. So why try? And then 2008 economic recession, and also the kind of leftist parties, which I wouldn't call really leftist, but were not performing really well. So people were really disappointed and not ready to vote for them anymore. So 2010 was a turning point, but not really. I think a lot of things came before that kind of created the opportunity for Fidesz to take over. But of course, and one of them is that we just got too comfortable with the institutions of democracy without really doing anything with them. And in the School of Public Life, we have this slogan that democracy is not a noun, but a verb. It only exists if you do it. And I feel like we didn't really do it. It was just there. It was a noun. It existed for us. So I think this 2010 came as a kind of moment of awakening when we realized that, you realize that democracy doesn't exist when they start, that democracy existed before that when they start taking away the institutions. The ombudsperson no longer has a right to do this. We no longer have labor rights. We no longer can do this. And then we started waking up. So in a way, I think the kind of Fidesz takeover also had this effect of people realizing what they didn't or what they didn't really appreciate before that. But of course, with Fidesz now, and it's a kind of, Viktor Orban is a poster child for the destruction of democracy. But also, I think it's important that he should be the poster child of destruction of the welfare state and the privatization of public goods, and the kind of strategic destruction of the rule of law, and creating an economic environment where people can be exploited really easily. So it's not only democracy that is going away from us, but all the kind of social guarantees that were there before. So just a few examples of what has been destroyed other than democracy is, labor rights have been really curtailed, election law has been changed, media freedom is basically non-existent in Hungary. LGBTQ rights are being eliminated right now. Migration, like policies regarding migration, are really, really harsh and anti-human in Hungary. The judicial system is being torn apart. Higher education is being totally privatized. So all of society is being taken apart. It's not only democracy that is being destroyed, and it's an important strategy of our current government to find specific groups that they can scapegoat and blame for the problems that exist in the country, and then use these groups as a way to justify their really anti-social actions. And it's really interesting to see how these groups, first it was the disabled, then it was the homeless, then it was migrants, then it was NGOs, and now it's LGBTQ people. And it's very, very clear how the government is using these groups to legitimize its own policies. And I think this is probably the biggest sin of the Fidesz government, to be honest, because this scapegoating really really magnifies or reinforces already existing racist and xenophobic and homophobic kind of tendencies in Hungarian society. And these will be the things that are most difficult to repair, I think, in the long run. And I just wanted to say that, so just one kind of last group of thoughts is that, so with the destruction of democracy by Fidesz, I think came a really important wave of awakening by social movements and civil society. We have seen the biggest protests in the past 10 years, and we have seen grassroots organizing really waking up. And I think one really important, so there is a pushback from civil society in Hungary, and I think it's getting stronger actually as a result of the pressure. And one example of this is that before 2019, so between 2010 and 2019, basically Hungary was ruled from one center of power. Fidesz had 2/3 majority in the parliament. They had majority in all the local governments, so they had power over everything. In 2019, we had local elections, and a lot of the local elections gave an opportunity for grassroots organizations and opposition parties to actually enter into alliances. And a lot of municipalities are now run by opposition parties or independent mayors or independent assemblies. And this is a very new situation. So now there is the center of power in the parliament, which is still ruled by Fidesz, but a lot of local municipalities are now run by opposition groups, which are gaining strength, hopefully, for next year's national elections. We will see, but it's important that the success of the municipal elections, I think, was mostly due to grassroots mobilization, and that grassroots organizations forced political parties to enter into alliances with each other and with grassroots organizations. So this kind of reclaiming of elections, even reclaiming of public life, is already taking place. And just the last thing that I want to say is that wherever I go and I tell people, hi, my name is Tessa and I'm from Hungary, the first word I hear is Viktor Orbán. And I'm always like, come on, like, look at me. Do I look like him? No. So whoever participates in this webinar, I want you to think of Hungary not as being equal to Viktor Orbán, but as tens of thousands of me, like people who are standing up for social justice and equality, because it's there, that Hungary is there. It's just not really publicized. And when we hold trainings in the School of Public Life, hundreds of people every year, we see all the people who are actually organizing and who are standing up for human rights and democracy and social justice, and they are there and working a lot. It's just that Viktor Orbán has a much better press, but you need to see us below the surface, because I think these groups are the future for Hungary, and we will be able to bring Hungary back to this root of democracy and social justice. But it's also important not to equalize Hungary with Viktor Orbán. There is another Hungary there too.
Thanks so much, Tessa. I really appreciate that bird-eyes view. And it really gets to a point that Nadia mentioned earlier about the importance of civic associations, particularly their role as safeguarding against the erosion of democracy. So I want to, if we can, have a group discussion about populism, a concept and idea that was raised both by Yasha in his comments, and Nadia has written extensively about populism. And so my question is why does populism so often align with authoritarianism? Why shouldn't populism really align more with a more robust and stronger democracy? And feel free to jump in at will.
Yeah, I'm happy to speak to that. I mean, I think it comes from the nature of what populism is. So our political system has two core goals, which is individual freedom and collective self-determination, right? So on the one hand, we want to ensure that people can say what they want, that they are able to associate with whom they want, that there's a part of life in which the state can't interfere in their decisions. And in order to sustain that, we need independent institutions, we need the rule of law, because if a prime minister or president who doesn't like what you say can simply send you to jail, you're never going to have that individual freedom. And the second aspiration, of course, is collective self-determination, in some sense that we together are the writers of our own fate, that we determine the rules by which we are collectively bound. What populists do is that they play these two different ideas off each other, and in the end both die, which is to say that they claim, the only real reason why we have political problems is that there's a kind of corrupt and unaccountable elite that's often in cahoots with all kinds of terrible people, but they don't care about quote people like you and me, people like the real people in quotation marks. And so what we need to do is to send somebody who truly speaks for the people into power. And it's not just that anti-elitist element, which exists in politics, in democracy all of the time, and which is not in itself worrying, but that anti-pluralist element, which makes it very concerning. It is the claim, as Evo Morales in Bolivia puts it more eloquently than anybody else in 11 letters of his Twitter handle, that Evo es pueblo. Evo is the people. He and he alone is the people. And so by definition, anybody who disagrees with him becomes illegitimate. And that is a claim that in very different ways, populists on the left like Morales, but also populists on the right, like Trump and Orban and so on and so forth, make. And what it leads them to is, I think, two things. The first is attacks on the individual freedoms of members of unpopular groups. Tessa outlined that very clearly for Hungary, sort of one after the other, they get attacked. As importantly, in the next step, attacks on independent institutions. Because if you think, hey, I alone represent the people, then how can it be legitimate for the press to criticize me? How can it be legitimate for the opposition to organize against me? How can it be legitimate for a court to say that something that I want to do isn't within my constitutional authority? The people who want to do this are all enemies of the people, right? We got to put them in their place. I actually speak for people, and I should be allowed to do what I want, to actually put the popular will into reality. So that turns liberal democracies into deeply illiberal democracies. And then in the next and final step, once somebody like that controls or has hobbled the press, once they control courts, have installed their own loyalists into the courts, once they have staffed electoral commissions with their own members, it becomes impossible to remove a democratically elected president or prime minister by democratic means. So in the end, they attack not just the liberal element of liberal democracy, but the democratic element as well. And so I think there's something about the logic of I am the people that pushes you, not in every single case, because sometimes the opposition manages to prevail, but pushes you towards these attacks on the core elements of our political system.
Yeah. Nadia, could you want to briefly respond to that?
Yeah.
We're up against the
We'll hear from Nadia, and then we'll bring in the students' questions.
Oh, I'm so sorry. No, I don't want to.
Go ahead, Nadia, after we hear from you.
So just to continue this conversation, I think I would propose to make a distinction between populists as movements of contestations, and there are many populist movements in democratic societies, but not we shouldn't use the populism for those kind of movements, but for when these movements once and succeed in becoming powerful, that entering the states, conquering a majority. At that point, it becomes frustrating and problematic. It's not yet a dictatorship, because populists don't abolish elections. Actually, they want to have more and more plebiscitary elections and so forth. They don't want, like the fascists, block the electoral system and to be safe from risk of collapsing. No, they're very actually stimulating the people in order to regain all the time legitimacy through voting. The other question that is interesting, according to me, is the following. I don't know how, I'll try to be very quick and very clear. The reification of procedures, reification, meaning all procedures, they are transformed into a possession. So it's not the principle of majority, but it's the good and my majority. It's not the principle of electoral, circular one today for us and tomorrow, who knows, for somebody else. But is the good democracy means the good electoral outcome, the good majority, because it's ours. We saw it very well with Trump when he refused to recognize that the other people or the opposition became majority, because it was as if the good people were declared to be in a minority, which is a contradiction. So there is this kind of possessive conceptions of power that belongs to them, and this is this is the risk. It's not because they are dictators. They're not dictators. They are radicalizations of these procedures to the point that those who claim to be the people, they have the good justification for using those procedures in the name of the people. You know, if we are the good people, why not? This violating the sense of procedural specificity of democracy. Yeah.
Okay.
Fascinating.
Yeah,
Fred, if Shannon could introduce, sorry, Vicky, did you want to say
another
something?
two-finger,
Yeah.
you don't mind. So 2 points. One, there's different types of populism. There's what, it could be called inclusionary or exclusionary. And so many populist experiences have expanded the vote, make easier voting technology, lowering the age of vote, bringing no groups into the voting public, have really expanded democracy in the majoritarian sense. They do have a problem with check and balances. I agree with that and with Nadia's point, but thinking that populism is always against democracy seems like a very kind of too big a view. And also, once you look, I think it's important to try to put ourselves of how it is viewed in the countries, how it is viewed. So for instance, Evo Morales might call himself Pueblo, so he's the people. But he was he tried to impose his candidate in the last mayoral elections. He imposed his candidate, but the people that he didn't choose within his own party ran with a different party, and they won in a lot of places. So, and when he wanted to, make a policy like a gas price increase, he faced, huge riots on the street, protests, and he had to come back. So yes, he wants to represent the people. That's his claim. But it's true that the people, it's more complicated than, he wants to represent it, even within his own movement. So I think it's important to understand that populism is more than the popular leader.
Thank you, Vicky. Shannon, will you introduce Paulo, who will bring some questions from the students?
Yes, absolutely. We're excited to have Paulo Musto with us today, a graduate student in the Collaboratory. He's a master's student in Columbia's School of International and Public Affairs, studying economic and political development. Paulo and other facilitators have been working with students to develop questions around this topic and other global challenges. Paulo, feel free to introduce yourself more and tell us a little bit more about your facilitator role, and then go right into the questions.
Thank you, Shannon. It's a pleasure to be here with you all today. I'm very much enjoying hearing these unique perspectives on this issue. My name is Paulo, and I'm a first-year graduate student at SIPA at Columbia University, where I'm getting a Master's of International Affairs. I'm a graduate assistant for the Global Collaboratory, where I facilitate reflection sessions, and I help guide our students through the collaboratory experience. So moving on to our student questions, our first question comes from Omar Kamuria. He is a Columbia College student from Kuwait, majoring in sustainable development. His question is, how has the COVID-19 pandemic impacted the governments and populations of countries with flawed democracies? So anyone feel free to take a stab at this one.
I would say disastrous. very briefly. I mean, in Hungary, the government has used the pandemic as an excuse to curtail more of our rights and destroy more of our institutions and centralize more power without actually delivering a lot of performance, because I think it would be justified. Like, I would see a justification in centralizing things if it was really efficient and helping people, but in Hungary, this is not necessarily the case. Unfortunately, we have the highest death rate per capita right now in the world, and there is transparency of information is a really big problem. Like, we don't know what's happening because information is not given to us, but also just in terms of reorganizing the healthcare system in the middle of the pandemic after it having been destroyed to a great extent is really, really harmful.
Yeah. Yasha, you spoke, Yasha, when you were making your remarks earlier about 2020 being the year that witnessed more regression in democracy, perhaps the highest in a generation. So how much of that do you attribute to the pandemic?
Yeah, so it's not just a pandemic, there's a lot of other factors going on as well, but it certainly is in part the pandemic. And we certainly have seen that, you know, a lot of governments introduced measures that were dressed up as trying to address the, you know, very real needs for a government response to COVID-19, but that actually had nothing to do with that. In some places, you saw attempts to declare a kind of state of emergency, attempts to certainly constrain political rights, including the rights to protest, but often also an increase in the ability of a government to rule by executive decree. And so I think what's happened is that in places that were on the cusp, authoritarian populists were close to being able to concentrate power in their own hands, the last year has at least accelerated that process, and perhaps in some cases it's made the difference. Perhaps in some cases it's actually given them the cover that they needed in order to centralize power to a sufficient degree to render elections so unfree and unfair the next time round, that the chances of removing them from office have gone down significantly.
Paulo, next question.
All right, thank you for these responses. Our next question comes from Nicholas de Costanzo. He is located here in New York City, and he is majoring in visual art. His question is, how does or can democracy play a role in conflicts between the United States and Pakistan during the pandemic?
Anyone want to take that on?
Maybe if we expand it a little bit, because one of the questions from the global audience is about Asia more broadly, and difficulties in finding democracy, as the person who's posing the question is asking. And that person is also asking specifically about Myanmar. So maybe if we go to that part of the world and welcome maybe a couple of observations if anyone has them.
Well, there are cases of coup d'etat and thus blocking the democratic stability. This was the Myanmar case. Or cases interesting, in my view, today, more challenging, the Chinese transformation of itself into mixed government. Now there is a huge literature about transforming the Chinese system into not an authoritarian one, but is a mix of democratic elements and authoritarian elements. This kind of hybridism that is attracting very much today many scholars and also politicians in the West. This is an interesting question now. This rehabilitation of China through making it a mixed regime, it's a way of including China in the history of the West, which was at the beginning a mixed regime construction. So that is an interesting object of discussion to me, because it seems to be a way of including all the world inside of the reflection on mixed regime, but it's a very challenging aspect, because it may seem that there are forms of legitimacy that they don't need to be democratic, and they can be partly democratic within a mixed regime. So I would invite you to reflect critically about this stream of attention in political science in particular.
Paulo?
Perhaps it's not an answer at all to that question. I'm so sorry.
All right, thank you. So our next question now comes from Maximilian Patel. He is from Hong Kong, but he's located here in New York. He is a music major. And his question is, income and wealth inequality seem a natural result of the capitalism and individualism that characterizes our American spirit. How do you believe this inequality has exacerbated the state of our democracy within the context of the pandemic? How can this inequality be remedied?
I mean,
Big question.
Yeah,
Vicky?
I think that has been coming through a lot of the presentation, right? That inequality is, and the rise in inequality is what creates a challenge to democracy that promise, at the very least, equality before the law and equality in power. So historically, the way of dealing with this challenge has been to use the political system to reduce inequality, right? So redistribution, and in different sense. I mean, in terms of income, of course, but in terms of status, of other ways. So using political power to make economic inequality less relevant. The trouble of the current situation is that the state that has been a crucial instrument in achieving this in the past, it seems weakened by the emergence of powers like, technological companies that can, carry information without no control from the state, or, a capitalist system that seems with very capital is so mobile that it's sometimes hard for the state that have been the political instrument for redistribution to effectively redistribute power, to make it more palatable, as Nadia said, more tolerable. And I think that weakness of states, I mean, of course, some countries, especially the less rich countries, and some areas, even within rich countries, have always had very weak states. But I think that it's crucial because most of the citizens, yes, they might vote or not every X number of years, they might participate or not, but their relationship with politics is how they see the state, be the policeman, be the hospital, be the teacher, be the public employee. And so a lot, if the state is not democratized in a more profound sense, inequality permeates every aspect of their lives.
Great.
Yeah, can I ask Vicky, if you don't mind, because you said you mentioned the state, but you've also written about the role of labor and labor unions. How do they figure in this moment?
So I think, in the US, it has been a very challenging time. I think labor unions have a difficult time in the sense that there's very rapid technological change that is producing rapid transformations in the labor market. And so at least in advanced economies, that has been a challenge, even for places in Western Europe where labor unions traditionally have been very strong. And in the rest of the world, the biggest challenge is that most of the labor force, or a large chunk of the labor force, is in the informal sector. So the economy is bifurcating. And so labor unions work well for what is called the insiders, but they do not work very well to very large chunks of people who have not been included in the formal labor market. And in numbers, that's a very large number of people around the world.
Paulo, I think you have two more questions left. So I'm going to suggest that maybe you combine them and ask the second question first, because I think your first one is a great one to have as a final question.
I completely agree. All right, then. So our next question comes from Octavio Borvillas. He is from my hometown, Princeton, New Jersey. And his question is, I once heard of a sort of axis of evil in the world made up of Putin, Trump, Netanyahu, MBS, referring to Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and El-Sisi as the most immediate threats to democracy worldwide. If you had to offer an updated version of that axis, who would it include?
Yasha?
Me? Why me? Well, I mean, I think the original axis of evil was a term used by George W. Bush with reference to Saddam Hussein and a bunch of countries at that time. So the list you mentioned is already significantly updated from the one that this term originally referred to. I think I'll make a meta observation, which I find interesting, which is that a lot of the response to that term at the time from sort of academics and so on was that it's very bad to use the term evil, but actually evil is not the right metaphysical category with which to talk about politics and politicians. And as often happens, the sort of political positions have shifted, and a lot of the same people now think that if you don't call populists and their followers evil, then you're not sufficiently expressing your outrage. And so this sort of preferences in how we describe the political world has shifted in very interesting partisan ways, including, you may note, among intellectuals and academics. And I actually think, as I often do, that there is something to the older form of leftism, that we should not think of either populists or people who vote for them as evil, and that for anybody who actually wants to live in a democracy, writing 50% of your fellow citizens off as irredeemable is hard to square with your underlying commitment to democracy. There can be people who vote for political candidates who I deeply dislike for reasons that I find troubling, but our task in a democracy is to persuade them to become part of more constructive political movements and projects, and not, to hope, as Bertolt Brecht once joked about the East Communist regime, that if we don't like the people as they are, we just elect a new one.
May I also say a brief 2 words? So sometimes we tend to think that democracy is the realm of perfection, or everything is fine. But democracy is capable of giving us very bad decisions and bad leaders. The question is not that the outcome. The question of democracy is the method thanks to which we can kick them off without risking a capital crisis, as we did in January the 6th. So that is a moment in which we understand the threshold between democracy and non-democracy. It is accepting to go home, accepting to lose, accepting the fact that our majority is not the best one, is one among the many majorities. And this is, for me, leaving aside all the richness of a democratic system, that threshold is fundamental. Which means that, it's a realm of imperfection capable of understanding its own perfection. This is a good way of putting democracy without asking too much to democracy. Otherwise, we are going to create some monsters around.
Paulo, on to the last question.
All right, so our last question is a very good one to end on. It comes from Isabel Seckler from Florida. She's majoring in environmental biology and sustainable development. And her question is, how can we express more agency as young adults in a democracy aside from voting?
Well, I think Georgia, I will leave you to go, but only that Georgia is a beautiful example of constructing the victory of 2 senators thanks to grassroots movements and permanent participation in the making of a party on the ground and not simply on the top. This is.
I do agree with Nadia that political participation is crucial. Political systems around the world privilege the elderly over the young because the young don't vote. In many countries, they're not allowed until a certain age. And even when they're allowed, they vote less. But I think if they're mobilized, and that's one of the things that populism has learned. If they become a threat because they're mobilized, they will be paid attention to. So if there are issues that are important for the youth, I think what they have to do to make democracy work more responsive to them is to mobilize and make those issues salient. So I agree with Nadia that grassroots participation is crucial in that sense.
Let me chime in with something. Look, I think people today have a very good sense of how they can be engaged. Certainly the kinds of people who are engaged enough to come and attend this webinar probably have a very good sense of both politics and some of the ways in which they can be effective. I do think that there is a tendency or temptation to focus action in the wrong places and to focus action on, posting on social media for and organizing with people who are already like-minded, sometimes on enforcing orthodoxy within small spaces, making sure that everybody within your peer group or within an institution like Columbia University is exactly on the same page on a set of issues, rather than trying to reach the many citizens of your country who actually have much, much deeper disagreements, who are much, much, much further away. So I think if you're thinking about how do we defend democracy against genuine threats to it, against liberal populists, against, in a context like the United States, somebody like Donald Trump, whether he runs again in 2024, or whether there's some kind of handpicked successor, making sure that you keep your little space in which most people more or less already agree with you anyway as pure as possible is not going to help with that. In fact, it might well be counterproductive. Thinking about how you can actually reach out to people who are out in the country, who may be more tempted to vote for people who you find abhorrent, thinking about how you can engage in constructive political dialogue with them, try to explain your concerns to them in a human and forthright way, which doesn't mean that you have to hide who you are, what your beliefs are, but which does mean that you have to respect them as your fellow citizens rather than denounce them. I think all of that is more productive for the future of democracy than the easy option.
Fred, we'll give you the last words to wrap this up before Shannon and I give our thanks and closing.
Yeah, I just want to say thanks to all the panelists. This has been the robust discussion that I had hoped it would be. I think we've had a great, wide and deep discussion. I wish we had more time, but alas, we've run out of time. So with that, Safwan.
Fred, thank you. Thank you, Fred, for your leadership of this, for framing the discussion and for so brilliantly moderating it. I mean, yes, the saddest thing is that an hour and a half has literally flown by. I could sit for hours listening to each of you. Thank you. Thank you, Nadia. Thank you, Vicky. Thank you, Yasha. And Tessa, we need more and more people like you. You are an embodiment of what Paulo's last question was seeking. And Paulo, thank you for bringing these questions. Thank you to all the students. Thank you to our global audience. And my apologies that we couldn't get to many really great questions. What we will try to do, Marika and August, if we can take care of this, we have a recording of the entire webinar, which we will share with everybody who has registered. But if we can also capture questions in the chat and try to direct them to some of the panelists, if you don't mind taking a few minutes maybe to answer questions that you'd like to answer via email. But this has been terrific. And Shannon, thank you. Thank you for the collaboratory and for Paulo and for all the students. And I'll turn it over to you, Shannon, to close it.
Sure, thank you. Well, our time is up, and I've truly enjoyed this engaging discussion about one of the most pressing concerns in the world today, the future of democracy. We've talked about everything from the meaning of democracy, race and politics, and the erosion of democratic norms in the US, democratic instability in consolidated democracies around the world, examining populism as an alternative powerful tool against liberal democracies, the bird's eye view of democracy at the grassroots level, and how the COVID-19 pandemic impacted the governments of countries with flawed democracy. As I mentioned earlier, this is the second seminar of the Spring Global Columbia Collaboratory, a virtual exchange platform that brings Columbia students, thought leaders, and educators from around the globe together to reflect, ideate, and collaborate to make an impact. We're looking forward to our next Future of Collaboratory seminar this semester. So please keep an eye out for the announcement. I also want to remind Columbia undergraduate students joining us today that the next application deadline for the collaboratory is April 26th, and this will be to participate in the summer cohort. Thanks again to the 4 esteemed panelists who joined us today, Vicky, Nadia, Tessa, and Yasha. I also want to thank our amazing moderator, Dean Frederick Harris, for the excellent job he did in framing our discussion. Many thanks to the team at Columbia Global Center's Columbia World Projects, Columbia College, and the Center for Undergraduate Global Engagement. And of course, we want to extend a very special thank you to our amazing collaboratory students, partners, and participants from around the world. A reminder that a link to a recording of the full seminar will be sent to everyone who registered. For others, you'll be able to find it in our website. Thank you and be well.